The cold evening wind swept through the quiet neighborhood as 12-year-old Jake hurried down the sidewalk, his hands tucked deep into his worn-out jacket pockets. The sun had almost disappeared behind the rooftops, leaving a soft golden hue in the sky. Jake wasn't in a rush to get home. There wasn't much waiting for him there. His mom worked late shifts at the diner, and their small apartment always felt a little too empty. But tonight, something unexpected was about to change his life forever. Just as he turned the corner by the local grocery store, he noticed an elderly woman struggling with several heavy bags. She looked exhausted, pausing every few steps to adjust her grip. Her frail frame swayed slightly as she tried to balance the weight of the groceries. Without thinking twice, Jake jogged up to her. "Mom, do you need help?" he asked. His voice gentle but firm. The woman looked up, startled for a moment before offering a tired smile. "Oh dear, that's very kind of you. These bags are heavier than I expected." Jake didn't hesitate. He carefully took the largest bags from her hands, feeling the weight immediately. He had helped his mom carry groceries plenty of times, but these were packed full. Still, he didn't mind. He knew what it felt like to need a helping hand. As they walked together, the woman introduced herself as Mrs. Dawson. She lived just a few blocks away, in one of the larger houses near the park. Despite her elegant coat and pearl earrings, there was something warm and humble about her. She asked Jake about school, about his family, about his life. He answered honestly. His dad had left years ago. His mom worked hard to keep things together, and money was always tight. But he didn't complain. "We do our best," he said with a small shrug. Mrs. Dawson listened intently, nodding as they walked. "You have a good heart, Jake. The world needs more boys like you." As they reached her house, a grand 2-story home with towering oak trees in the front yard, Jake couldn't help but stare. It was the kind of house he had only seen in movies, the kind where life seemed easy and warm. But before he could dwell on the thought, Mrs. Dawson dug into her purse and pulled out a few crumpled bills. "For your kindness," she said, offering them to Jake. He shook his head quickly. No, I didn't do it for money." Mrs. Dawson smiled, touched by his sincerity. "I had a feeling you'd say that." She tucked the money back into her purse, her eyes twinkling with something Jake couldn't quite place. Just then, the front door opened and a tall man stepped out. He was sharply dressed, with a confident stride and an air of authority. His eyes landed on Jake, then on the grocery bags in his hands. "Mom, who's this?" the man asked, his deep voice filled with curiosity. Mrs. Dawson turned to her son with a look of pride. "This is Jake. He helped me carry the groceries home." The man studied Jake for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he smiled. "That was very kind of you, young man." Jake simply nodded, feeling a little out of place. He was about to say goodbye when the man spoke again. "Wait," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Why don't you come inside for a minute?" Jake hesitated. He didn't belong in a house like this, but there was something in the man's voice, something that made him pause. Mrs. Dawson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Come in, Jake. I insist." Still unsure, Jake followed them inside, not knowing that this simple act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Jake stepped hesitantly into the house, feeling as if he had just walked into another world. The warmth inside immediately wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the chilly evening air outside. The living room was spacious, with high ceilings and a grand staircase that led to the upper floor. A chandelier hung overhead, casting a soft, golden glow. The furniture looked expensive, the kind Jake had only seen in magazines at the barber shop. Everything smelled fresh, like lavender and wood polish. Mrs. Dawson led him to a cozy sitting area, motioning for him to take a seat on the plush couch. He sat cautiously, unsure if he was supposed to sink into something so comfortable. The tall man, who had yet to introduce himself, took a seat across from him, still studying him with quiet curiosity. "I'm Daniel," the man finally said, offering his hand. "Mrs. Dawson's son." Jake shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. He could tell right away that Daniel was someone important, though he didn't know why. "You live around here, Jake?" Daniel asked, leaning forward slightly. Jake hesitated. "Not too far. My mom and I have a small place near the diner on 8th Street. Daniel nodded, as if he recognized the area. "And your father?" Jake's fingers curled slightly against his jeans. He was used to the question, but that didn't mean he liked answering it. "He left a long time ago." Daniel exchanged a glance with his mother before turning his attention back to Jake. "I see." Mrs. Dawson, sensing Jake's discomfort, quickly changed the subject. "Jake helped me without asking for anything in return," she said proudly. "That kind of kindness isn't easy to find." Daniel seemed to consider this for a moment before standing up. "Come with me," he said. Jake wasn't sure what was happening, but something about Daniel's tone made it impossible to refuse. He glanced at Mrs. Dawson, who gave him an encouraging nod, then followed Daniel down a hallway. They stopped at what looked like a home office. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a large desk sat in the center, papers stacked neatly. On top, Daniel walked over to a cabinet, pulled open a drawer, and took out a sleek leather wallet. "I want to give you something," Daniel said, flipping it open. Jake immediately shook his head. "I don't need money." Daniel chuckled, though his expression remained serious. "Not money, something better." He pulled out a crisp business card and handed it to Jake. The thick paper felt important, embossed with Daniel's name and a company logo. "I own a few businesses in the city," Daniel explained. "Restaurants, retail stores, real estate, you name it." He pointed to the card. "That's my direct number. If you ever need anything, help, advice, even a job, you call me, no matter what." Jake stared at the card, feeling the weight of the moment. No one had ever offered him something like this before. He wasn't sure what to say. "I don't just hand these out, you know," Daniel added. "But I see something in you. You remind me of myself when I was younger." Jake's eyes flickered up. "You do." Daniel leaned against the desk. "I wasn't born into this," he said, gesturing around the room. "I grew up in a small apartment, just like you. My mom worked hard, just like yours. We struggled, a lot, but one day, someone gave me a chance. Just one opportunity. And that changed everything." Jake absorbed Daniel's words, something stirring inside him. Could his life really change too? Just then, Mrs. Dawson appeared in the doorway. "Jake, dear, would you like to stay for dinner?" His stomach betrayed him before he could answer. Growling loudly, he hadn't eaten much since lunch, and the smell of something delicious was drifting in from the kitchen. Mrs. Dawson laughed. "I'll take that as a yes." Jake glanced at Daniel, who nodded. "Stay," he said simply. "You're welcome here." For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he wasn't just passing through someone else's life. He was being invited into it. But as he sat down at the dining table, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was only the beginning of something much bigger. What he didn't know was that the opportunity Daniel had just given him would come with challenges he never expected, ones that would test his character, his choices, and the very definition of what it meant to be truly wealthy. The dinner table was set beautifully, with steaming dishes of roasted chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and fresh-baked bread. Jake could hardly believe he was sitting there, sharing a meal with Mrs. Dawson and Daniel, as if he were part of their world. Every bite felt like something out of a dream. Warm, filling, comforting. For a boy used to simple meals, this was a feast. As they ate, Daniel asked Jake more about his life. He wanted to know about school, his favorite subjects, and what he wanted to do when he grew up. Jake hesitated. He had never really thought about it in a serious way. Survival had always been more important than dreams. I don't know, Jake admitted. I guess I just want to help my mom. Make life easier for her. Mrs. Dawson smiled warmly. That's a noble goal. Daniel studied him for a moment before speaking. You're smart, Jake. And you have something rare. Integrity. You could do something great if you had the right support. Jake wasn't sure how to respond. No one had ever told him he could be great before. After dinner, Daniel walked Jake to the front door. The night air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. Remember what I said, Daniel told him. If you ever need anything, call me. Jake nodded, gripping the business card tightly. He didn't know if he would ever actually use it, but it felt like a piece of something bigger. Like a door had been opened, even if he wasn't sure. He was ready to walk through it yet. As the days passed, life went back to normal. School, chores, helping his mom. But something had changed inside Jake. He started paying closer attention in class, pushing himself harder. He couldn't shake Daniel's words from his mind. Maybe he could do more. Maybe he should. Then, one afternoon, everything took an unexpected turn. Jake was walking home from school when he spotted a group of men outside the diner where his mom worked. They were in suits, talking quietly near a sleek black car. Something about them felt off. As he got closer, he realized one of them was Daniel. Jake's heart leaped. He hadn't seen him since that night at Mrs. Dawson's house. But why was he here? Before he could call out, Daniel spotted him. His expression shifted. Surprise, then something else. A flicker of urgency. He excused himself from the group and walked over. Jake, he said, lowering his voice. What are you doing here? I was just going home. Jake replied. Why are you here? Daniel hesitated, glancing back at the men. Then he sighed. I came to see your mother. Jake's stomach twisted. Why? Daniel took a deep breath. Because I owe her something. A long time ago. Jake stared at him, confused. You know my mom. Daniel nodded. We grew up in the same neighborhood. Before I made something of myself, she helped me. She gave me food when I was hungry. Encouragement when I had nothing. I never forgot that. He paused, his eyes filled with something deep, and I never repaid her. Jake felt like the world had just tilted. His mother had never mentioned knowing Daniel. She had never talked about helping anyone besides him. And yet, here was this wealthy, successful man, standing in front of him, admitting that she had been part of his story. What are you going to do? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel smiled. The same thing she did for me. Help. That evening, Jake sat with his mum as she read over a letter Daniel had given her. It was an offer, one that could change everything. Daniel wanted to give her a stable job at one of his companies, with better pay and benefits. He wanted to move them into a safer neighborhood. He wanted to give back what had once been given to him. Tears filled her eyes as she folded the letter. I never expected anything in return, she whispered. Jake's heart swelled. He had spent years believing that kindness was just something you gave, without ever expecting anything back. But here was proof that goodness had a way of coming full circle. And so, life changed. His mother took the job. They moved to a better apartment. Jake had new opportunities in school. He kept Daniel's business card in his pocket, not because he needed it anymore, but as a reminder of that night, of the moment his life had shifted. One simple act of kindness had set everything in motion, and as he walked home from school one afternoon, watching the golden sun dip behind the rooftops, Jake knew one thing for sure. When the time came, he would pass that kindness on to someone else, because that was how change really happened. One person, one choice, one moment at a time.